And you know what time it is if you're listening to this music. It's time for Bennington Today over WBTN AM 1370, Southwestern Vermont's community radio station, WBTNAM.org, for streaming on the web or on our very own WBTN app, which you can get at the Google Play or the iTunes Store. Good morning, my friends. It is 11:08 in the morning. It is March 12th. It is 32 degrees and 64% humidity. The wind out of the east at 4 miles an hour, which basically says it's not really there. Just a slight, tiny breeze. It is my pleasure to offer for your listening enjoyment this morning and no doubt education. Today's guest, Mark Isselhardt, Maple Specialist, University of Vermont Extension Agent, just like the beloved John Page. Good morning, sir.
Thanks, Thomas. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
It's my pleasure and our pleasure. As I was talking to Mark off the air, we had a wonderful time with the surprise visit of Dave Nutter this morning on the morning show, who very, very colorfully explained how he's become a maple sugar person, a maple syrup maker, and all of with his pails and his carrying and all the other things that he's learned. And, of course, today is about maple. So before we start on that subject, I'm going to ask you the signature question, which is, what in your childhood brought you to who you are today?
That's a great question. Well, it actually feels a bit like a homecoming because I did grow up in Bennington on Harrison Avenue, and my mom still lives here. And before I came here to BTN this morning, I was at the CDC talking about maple to the Natural Resources Forestry class.
Fantastic.
Which I had actually taken that exact class 25 years ago this year.
No kidding.
Yeah, from Frank Lamb. So it was a homecoming in many ways. It was a wonderful experience to share what I've learned since those high school days in the 1900s. And so to answer your question more directly, I didn't grow up in an agricultural family or a background in that. But, even growing up
But you grew up here
in Bennington. You certainly
can't help it.
Yep. The forest is all around, and I had friends whose families made syrup, and I made myself some pretty terrible backyard syrup with friends in high school.
Did you?
Oh yeah, no, it was grade Z, and
Grade Z.
Definitely did not fit the standard.
What was the problem? The boiling?
I think probably a lot of problems, but it until you've actually done it, it's hard to really understand. The time, the complexity of getting it just right.
Yeah.
So we learned a little bit.
Is it? I mean, you are an expert in the area, and is it hard to understand or believe that the indigenous people just figured this out over eons of time, as it were?
Yeah. Well, my perspective on that question is, I think. Early cultures were really good at observing.
Yes.
And they could see patterns in nature.
Yes.
And I would actually argue that the early human inhabitants of the Northeast were not the first sugar makers. It was actually the squirrels, believe it or not, who would...
Seriously?
And I believe the Native Americans observed the squirrels' behavior and put two and two together and figured out. But... no, it's very well documented, actually, even in the research, that squirrels will, when the sap is running, you have to have a dormant tree, no leaves on.
Right.
But in the spring especially, the squirrels will have a pattern of nipping off fine branches, fine twigs.
Right.
And during periods of sap flow, sap will come out of the twig, and over the course of the day or multiple days, there'll be a little bit of evaporation that will take place, and a little sugar crystal will develop at the end of that twig. The squirrels will then... have a pattern whereby they'll go back and reharvest those little crystals, and I'm fairly confident in saying that although the legend of a tomahawk hitting a tree and the sap being boiled down, is an important story, but I think
it's not impossible.
I think they probably observed
the
squirrels doing it first.
Brother squirrel being the teacher. I observed a squirrel doing something that I had no idea that they did. It made me very angry because I would eat those apples, but my friend has an apple tree right on the corner of his house, and he has a screened-in porch, but, very nice windows. And one day I'm in there, and I see this squirrel go on the tree. I hear a pop. I'm sitting in there, and I hear pop. And what's going on? And I get up, and there's the squirrel, and he's grabbing an apple, and he's taking chunks out of the apple and turning it, and then he gets to the seeds, and he eats the seeds. He throws the rest away.
Oh, yeah.
And I went, "What are you doing?" I yelled at him. He didn't care. He just kept doing it. I went outside, tried to stick him off the tree. Nah, he just jumped to another place, kept eating it, and I had no idea they did such things. So
I guess getting back to your question, I was in the environment. There are trees all around. Some of my elementary school years was spent in North Bennington at the Prospect School. We had a lot of outdoor time, a lot of examples of just observing nature, and I think that probably stimulated a little bit of interest in the natural world. In high school, I did the Governor's Institute of Vermont, which is a summer program for students in natural resources. I came back for my senior year in high school, took that natural resources class in the CDC. I went to UVM for forestry. My work-study job when I was in forestry school was at the Maple Research Center.
Wow. So you're really steeped in it.
I have a long track record in maple, that's true.
That's fantastic. Well, tell us, how are maples? What is the health of our maples? Yeah,
generally I would say good. There are plenty of threats to sugar maple health. It's important to differentiate, too, because historically sugar maples have always been the trees that we tap for sap collection, but more and more sugar makers are tapping red maple as well, a different species, slightly different life history, strategy, natural history.
Why is that?
Well, they're different species, for one, and they, a forest is a competition. It's a competition for light, water, and nutrients, and like all ecosystems, individuals will be able to compete in certain niches better than others. Red maple has a little bit wider range of niches it can compete on. So whereas sugar maple sometimes is called the Goldilocks tree, where it likes it a little bit wet but not too wet. It likes the soils just right. And in those environments, in those stands, they compete very well. But when you get out of that ideal range, they'll still exist, but they won't be nearly as dominant. Red maple is a little better at a wider range of conditions. For a long, long time, red maple is seen as inferior. The syrup people thought was less sweet. They thought that, and still believe that, the end of the sugaring season, red maple their natural history is that they flower early in the spring. And the thought would be that you would make an off-flavored syrup as a result, and therefore you could contaminate otherwise good sap with this red maple sap. We've found that more and more producers are using red maple and not really seeing as big an impact as maybe they thought they would. So there's still plenty more to learn about that, but for the most part, sugar maple, a little more sensitive, potentially more at risk to issues of a warming climate or issues of soil conditions changing due to acid precipitation, that sort of thing. Red maple is a little more durable, but I would say in general, sugar maple health is good. There are native threats like forest tent caterpillar, which is a native insect. It erupts every 10 to 15 years, maybe even as long as 20-year rotations of fairly large-scale defoliation events, and then they drop back down again. But they're always there in small numbers. It's important to know that forest tent caterpillar are not the ones that make those little webs that you see in the branches of maybe an apple or a cherry tree.
Right.
That's actually called an eastern tent caterpillar. And just to confuse you, sometimes the forest tent will crawl over the webs and make it look like it's their home, but it really isn't. Forest tent is really more in the woods, in the forest, and like I said, is a native defoliator, and there are lots of native controls, natural controls, both parasitic flies and there are viruses that will knock those populations down. So you might get 2 or 3 years of pretty severe defoliation, and it's not statewide. It typically will be, right now, the northeast part of the state is kind of at the end of an outbreak. About 10 years ago, folks around here might remember there was a fair amount of defoliation in Bennington, Rutland counties, a little bit in Windham and Windsor, but not as much in the north. And it's like so many things, it's a natural process. There'll be some mortality, but by and large, most defoliated trees will survive.
They will?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
So there's no active projects that are involved with them in terms of a defense, in terms of trying to wipe them out or knock down their numbers or anything like that when there's an outbreak?
Forest 10. Well, sugar makers have the ability to use a biological control. It's a naturally occurring material that's in soil that can be refined and sprayed when the timing is just right. And it disrupts the insect's digestive system and they die. But like so many things, it doesn't only affect that one caterpillar. So that's why it's not used everywhere all the time. So any caterpillar would, if it could ingest it, if it did ingest it, it would have a hard time. So it tends to be just strictly for sugar bushes and very delineated blocks within that sugar bush. And it can help. If the timing is right, the caterpillar has to be just the right stage of development. The leaves have to be just the right amount of emergence. It can work. But at the same time, the tree does have pretty robust defenses against it. And these have been around for a long time.
Right.
And so I'm pretty sure if sugar maples needed us to do that for them to survive, they would have been gone a long time ago.
Right. Just as a general question, and I often wonder about this because I am so, like so many other people, in love with the forests. How are our forests?
Probably don't have enough time to totally cover that question, but I'll say in general, Vermont is still a heavily forested state. The biggest pressures on the biological side have to do with invasive species, both insects and plants, that are just, evolved in another climate, another ecosystem.
Right.
And when they are introduced, don't have the same controls that are in place and can then crowd out and outcompete native, which, start very small, maybe one or two little barberry plants in your understory, or maybe an insect or two that get hold. And it doesn't seem like a big deal, but getting them out once they're established can be really challenging.
Well, I had personal experience with that. I go hunting down in North Pownell, off of North Pownell Road, up on and there is a wash, a big wash that comes all the way down from the ridge, and that place somehow got infested with barberry, and it's just it's unbelievable.
Yeah.
How first of all, how difficult it is to traverse them. That's one thing. But when you're all dressed up in hunting clothes, it doesn't matter. But it certainly has changed the entire reality of that place.
Yes.
And it's just exploded. And it's like, well, now what do you do?
Right.
I know if it was my property, which it isn't, I'd be in there somehow doing something to get rid of it because. You can tell that it's very difficult to get rid of. Just looking at it, you can tell it's a very, very, very hardy.
You can do mechanical
Yeah,
control,
right,
like
exactly.
yank it out of the ground, which is hard.
Yeah.
Sometimes
in there backhoe and get to work.
Sometimes you can do chemical control, but not always.
No.
And then it has other problems associated with it.
Exactly.
So on the plant side, we see buckthorn, honeysuckle.
Honeysuckle's not native?
Honeysuckle, not the ones that are of real concern. And sometimes it's shading out native trees that are trying to germinate and just taking over, and that can be a real problem. And then you have insects. Asian longhorn beetle has gotten a lot of press.
We have a PSA about it.
Yeah, and it's a real concern. I don't want to minimize it at all, but it seems like that insect, once it's identified in a given area, they seem to be fairly effective at developing a quarantine and holding the insect within that. Worcester, Mass. is the closest location for an infestation, and the federal government has spent millions and millions of dollars eradicating infested trees there, and it's kind of what it takes. It's a huge amount. But it only takes one person to take, I found some firewood on the side of the road, now I'm going to go to camp. And then, then that material, the beetle can only cover so much ground on its own, but it can travel as far as you drive it when it's in a car.
Right.
That's why moving firewood is such an important thing to think about.
A lot of people don't know that that's against the law. I know in Connecticut, when you go from New York State to Connecticut on Route 84, there's a big sign, and it says, you cannot bring firewood into the country. Usually don't take a call, but let's see who this is. Good morning, you're on the air.
Yeah, Tom, this is Michael Lee.
Hi, Mike.
Hey, one plant they didn't mention, and I'd like you to, is bittersweet. We've got an awful invasive type of bittersweet in the country now, and it'll kill forests. It strangles the trees.
Yeah, you're talking about the oriental bittersweet, I think?
I imagine, yeah.
Yep. Yeah, it's almost like a vine. Yep, you're right. That's
It'll
a tough
wrap
one.
itself right around the trees and just choke them right out.
Do you have problems with that on your property, Mike?
I'm going to start cutting some, yep.
Yeah, wow. Well, I'm really glad you brought that up.
I will point out that there's a website that Extension is involved with called VT Invasives, and if you Google that, you'll find out a little more information about the particular species you're concerned about, and maybe even some information about control, how best to handle it. Because the timing of when you take it out and how you treat it, you can sometimes make things worse. So I would do a little bit of homework. And just like cutting a beech, there's a time to cut it to limit the amount of suckers you get. It can be the same way for some of these invasive species.
Yep, I watched a show on one of our local television channels here. I can't remember if it was Channel 16 or 17, but it was Claude Dern and one of the foresters, and they were showing just how bad it had strangled that section of forest.
Yep, it is impressive.
It is, yep. Okay, then.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Yep, take care.
Take care. That was Mike Lilly, a wonderful friend of the show.
So one thing I'll say about invasive plants and insects is chances are identification won't be a professional in the natural resources field. It'll almost always be a concerned citizen who sees something that they look at every day just doesn't look quite right. Like, I've never seen that bug before, or what's this plant? I don't recognize those leaves.
What about these worms?
Yes.
The Korean, I think they're Korean. The long worms, the
crazy snake worms.
Thank you very much. The crazy snake worms that are what they're selling for trout for fishing.
Yeah, it's a real concern.
It's a strange reality. If it's hurting our forests, why are they selling it for fishing?
Yeah, I'm not familiar enough with what they're selling for bait to say that for sure.
I know for sure.
I know that a lot of the concern that we've seen is coming from horticultural material, plants and shrubs. But yeah, no, it's a real concern. They can get in the woods. They start to degrade the understory and the soil by consuming all the organic matter and making it so that native species can't germinate. And they can do a lot of damage in a short period of time. And they multiply very quickly as well.
Yes, they do. I saw that with my own eyes, my own experience, personal experience.
Yeah.
And they're big and they're long and they're fast, and I was really kind of stunned.
So I would say, there's good health. There's reason for optimism as far as our forests are concerned. There's also real concern, but it shouldn't be paralyzing. It should be,
mobilizing.
Stay observing, observant, and if you see something that doesn't seem quite right, try to track down a professional. I'll leave my contact information if anyone has any questions. And sometimes, it's probably always better to be wrong, but say something than to say, well, I just have never seen it. Who cares?
Well, I know Alan Baker, who does our Politics of Food on Thursdays at 1 o'clock. He gets calls every once in a while from people who are concerned about what they might see. And one day he left here, he said, I got to go down to the river and see. Somebody said they saw such and such. I got to make sure that that's not what it is.
Yeah.
And so it's it's great to hear that our forests are good, in relatively good health, but it's also important for everybody. The more we can learn about what is and what isn't, the more we can use our phones and make the call and alert people, because you just can't be everywhere.
So the other part of the question about forest is less biological and more sort of human-related, and that's how ownership patterns have changed over time, and how it used to be that we had large blocks of forest land, and we are seeing a parcelization and splitting up of large tracts into smaller tracts, which if you look across the landscape, you can't obviously see the property boundaries,
right? Unless
you know that area very well, but you can't see how it's broken up, and it can be challenging when you have lots of small blocks. You can have issues with integrity of the forest. Right. You can have development pressure that wasn't there if it was a large block. So I don't want to discount the impact that how ownership has changed and how we actually are seeing a little, very small, but a small reduction in the total amount of forest cover in Vermont. That trend may continue as more and more large blocks get broken up into small blocks. I mean, there's so many things to cover on that alone, but the economic pressures of holding large blocks of forest, that's one of the reasons why it happens. Yep. But there are some bright spots. I would say maple is one of them, because producers are able to derive an annual income from maple, and we're learning more and more about how to produce it most efficiently. And
exactly.
So I think there's reason for optimism as well. But I would say the way ownership has progressed over the last 25, 30 years, is a concern for some.
You brought, speaking of maple, a wide array of bottles, I see. And why don't we get into that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So my job as a maple specialist involves everything from what we just talked about, tree health, both on the macro level but also on a micro level, individual tree health, all the way to the finished product and beyond, how it's marketed and that sort of thing. So I thought maybe we would talk a little bit about syrup quality. And talk a little bit about how maple syrup is graded.
Yeah, which has changed.
It has changed, yep. It's not the only time it's changed, but it's the most recent time.
Oh, it isn't?
Oh, it's changed many times over the years. We are all very familiar with the one that we grew up with, and so it seems like it's the only one that's ever existed. But no, there have been lots of changes.
So before grade A and grade B, there was something else?
There was something else,
really?
Yeah. So what I want to do is I want to acknowledge the past, acknowledge the old grading system, but make sure everyone realizes that the syrup we're talking about that's on sale, either from your local producer or at a grocery store, they all meet the standards for what's called grade A maple syrup. Now, anyone who's grown up or had produced syrup or grown up around maple with the old system would have made the link between grade B equals dark, strong flavored syrup.
Right.
Now, imagine you're not from an area where maple is produced, and maybe you're on the other side of the world, and you see a store shelf, and there's grade A maple syrup and grade B. If you are able to afford
you're going to think that buying grade A is the better.
You probably buy grade A milk if you can afford it versus grade B. So you would intuitively think grade A was better. So one of the reasons why the system was changed was we produce so much more syrup than we did even 25 years ago. Vermont alone produces 3.5 times the syrup that we did back then. And we produced a lot of syrup back then as well. But
it's 20% of the national
Vermont produces
production.
Over 40%
of
the U.S. production.
Of the U.S. production.
And that is not all being sold to Vermonters.
No.
And so the idea of marketing, and you don't have much time with consumers, and so anything that can make it more clear, that's why they included the flavor descriptor as well. So it's not just golden, but it's golden, delicate taste.
I see.
An amber, rich taste. Dark, strong taste. Or strong, robust, and then the very dark, strong. It was trying to give a little bit of a clue to a consumer what they were about to taste. So what I brought in some samples of good tasting syrup, and I brought in some samples of maybe syrup that has some issues and doesn't belong in a retail container.
Wow.
But it's the producer's job to identify those flavors before they put them in a retail container and put them in the marketplace.
Okay.
So are you ready for this?
I'm ready.
Okay. So I'm not sure how we're going to do this across the desk. But
No, we don't have to.
Okay.
We can move.
Okay.
There we go.
So let's calibrate our palettes here. We'll start, for those of you who are not in the room, we have a very light colored syrup that we're about to taste. Now, before you taste it, what I like to say about flavor, first of all, flavor is weird. Flavor it's just an odd thing. We all have different experiences.
Yes.
We have preferences.
Mm-hmm.
Some of us have more or less concentration of taste buds. Some people can't smell at all. All those things impact our sense of flavor.
Our experience, right.
If you grew up being told that Fancy was the only true maple and everything else, was to be sold elsewhere, then you're going to have one set of preferences versus people who just like dark flavored stuff.
Right.
So, knowing that is important when you're trying to be critical about flavor and think about it. But the first thing to do is look at the color.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure that there's nothing floating in it, and make sure that that's going to give you a clue, just those visual clues of what you're about to taste.
Mm-hmm.
And then always want to smell before you taste.
Yeah.
This is true of syrup or anything.
Yeah, or
really.
anything. Right.
It's
Wine.
good. So you want to smell, and then you want to taste, and you want to put it in your mouth, and you want to try to coat your tongue.
Mm-hmm.
This is really what I recommend producers do when they're really trying to grade the syrup and put the right appropriate label on. So put it in your mouth. Coat the tongue. How does that taste?
Very interesting taste. It is a light syrup. It's light in color and it's light in weight.
Right.
It is not a thick, heavy, deep. It's a very light syrup, and I would not, almost to the point of say watery. It's not. It's watery compared to what I consume.
Yeah.
But it's interesting how light it is.
So in Vermont and anywhere that grades maple syrup, there are 4 standards.
Mm-hmm.
It's color, clarity, flavor, and density. Density, syrup has to fall within a range in density.
Mm-hmm.
In Vermont, it's 66.9 to 68.9 bricks, which is a measure of sugar content.
Okay.
If you go below that, it's out of grade and doesn't belong in a retail container. It's more likely to spoil, either mold or become fermented.
Mm-hmm.
If it goes above that upper level, 68.9, more likely to crystallize.
Uh-huh.
And you're giving away sugar because you sell based on volume, not by sugar content.
Mm-hmm.
And those sugar crystals in the bottom, they're kind of hard to work with. When you get the bottom of a jug, if you can't get them out, it's just waste. So sugar makers have to make sure they're precise with their measurements of density and keep it in that range. Clarity, it's fairly easy. It's either clear and well filtered or it's not. Color, there are 4 grades, like I said. They each have a range in color, and maple producers need to compare the sample they're judging with a standard and put it in the appropriate color class.
Okay.
And flavor is the last thing you judge, really. It's typically flavor will be stronger as you go darker in color,
Mm-hmm.
and the density is the same. Even the darkest, blackest syrup is still within that range in density. It's a little bit of a trick of the eye that they're a little thicker,
Mm-hmm.
but even subtle differences in density can make it seem thicker. So here's another one. This is also a pretty light colored syrup.
Now, did that one we just had, did that have a category? Is it?
That was a golden.
That's a
delicate.
golden.
Yep.
Really?
It was a good tasting syrup.
Wow.
It was appropriate. It was right at the legal standard for density.
Wow, very interesting. Aroma's about the same.
A little different.
Yeah. Very different.
So if you had to use a word, how would you describe the flavor of that?
Well, this flavor is stronger, but it's also more caramelly.
Some people get a chocolate from that as well, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah, not so much.
Maybe.
So that's an off flavor.
Really?
Yeah, that syrup is what's called metabolism off flavor.
Huh.
And it's not a particularly intense variety. Off flavors can be on a range of intensity from mild to strong.
Mm-hmm.
And that one is a little bit on the mild to medium side. Some people will get a Tootsie Roll or a little bit of a chocolatey kind of flavor.
Yes, the Tootsie Roll, that was definitely there.
That one, that off flavor will show up not at the end of the season, but more in the middle or the beginning. And it can be associated with a prolonged cold with dramatic warm-up all at once.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know the physiology behind it so well. We do know the chemicals involved naturally occurring in that sap that when concentrated and reacting in the evaporator cause that flavor to form.
I could see how this would be a popular flavor, though, because it's so different.
Yeah, it is funny how some people will like that and want more of it, even though it does not fit the grade standard for grade A.
Interesting.
It still has value. It would probably be sold as what's called processing grade syrup, not in a retail container, but in 5-gallon jugs or larger, and then get incorporated into something else like a barbecue sauce or a glaze on a ham.
And then they would say maple syrup was part of the ingredient. We're part of the ingredients.
It just doesn't fit the definition of grade A maple syrup.
Okay.
So here's another one.
Now this one's darker.
This is darker, yep. It's a good idea to smell first.
Interesting. Wow. Wow, that's totally different.
What comes to mind?
It's like it's got some bee honey mixed in with this.
Yeah, almost a little sour maybe too.
In the aftertaste, certainly. Yes,
Yeah.
There it is.
So this is a defect that is caused almost entirely by allowing sap to sit too long before you boil it, and is more common later in the season when air temperatures are warmer. And this is actually called sour sap. That's the off flavor. Did you notice the consistency was a little different too?
It was.
There's actually almost like a little stringiness to it.
Yeah.
That's because the way this works is some of the sugars in maple sap, it's almost all sucrose.
Mm-hmm.
When sour happens, some of that sucrose has been broken apart into what's called invert sugar, a combination of glucose and fructose, and they then get further combined and make these long, stringy, what are called polysaccharides. You could almost see a little stringiness to it. When it goes really, really bad, we get what's called ropey syrup, which is almost a gelatinous material. So it really has to do with sanitation, boiling your sap as fast as possible. If you're a producer who's run into this, it's really important you clean everything, drain everything, including the sweet in your evaporator, that partially boiled syrup. Clean it all with hot water, even the little float boxes and elbows, everything gets cleaned. If you have good weather afterwards, you can go back to making good syrup. But if you leave in even a little bit, it's like a sourdough starter.
Oh, wow.
And will contaminate otherwise good sap.
Oh, wow.
You still up for more?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Let's keep going.
Let's try this one. Also a dark variety.
Much stronger aroma.
Any impressions on?
Very complex, smoky.
Do you think it fits the definition of grade A maple syrup?
No.
Yeah. So this is what's called scorch. This is syrup that either the level of the sap in the pans got too low and actually burned on the pan, or sometimes the calcium buildup that we call sugar sand or niter, those can get built up so much that It impedes the boiling, and they can flake off a little bit, and sugar can get trapped underneath and burn. And so this definitely does not belong in a retail container.
No wonder it seemed familiar. It tastes a little bit like my cooking.
Now, that being said, some people will like this flavor.
Yeah.
And it has lots of uses, culinary mostly. It just doesn't fit the definition of either golden, amber, dark, or very dark.
But you couldn't
syrup.
really find this on the retail market. Certainly not in the tourist market, I would say.
Well, actually, there is a company. There's at least one person in Vermont making a smoked maple syrup.
And that's the base of it.
Well, no, I believe they use a regular syrup and then do infuse the smoke into it after.
Okay.
So, yeah, I believe if people are interested, they can find that out in the marketplace.
But if they had a batch that turned out like that, what would stop them from selling it as a smoky or a?
Well, they couldn't put it in a container and call it grade A.
No,
maple
certainly
syrup.
not. No.
I guess they could call it something else.
Right.
Even if the only ingredient is grade A maple syrup, as long as they were very clear in the labeling. I would want to check with the folks at the Consumer Protection Section at Agency of Ag. To the fine points on labeling can be a little tricky, but
now what about in as the previous one would be utilized for a barbecue sauce and sold commercially, not retail, wholesale as it were. What about that? Could that be done in the same way? Could that be sold as, somebody who really likes a smoky barbecue? Oh, this will really do my barbecue sauce well.
Right. Yeah, it would all fall under that processing grade, and that is kind of a catch-all.
I see.
It's stuff that doesn't meet the grade A standard, but still has value. There's a cost of production issue, too. If you can only get half the value of that syrup when you sell it as processing grade, there's a point at which it's costing you more money to make that syrup than it's worth.
Okay.
And you need to understand your bottom line and probably make the decision to pull the plug, hopefully before you get to that point where it's costing more to make than sell.
You hear that, Dave?
So we're going to keep going here. Here's another. I know a lot of these have been dark syrup with the off flavor, and that doesn't necessarily mean that dark syrup is off flavored inherently. But
my God,
that's not an uncommon reaction.
what the heck is that? That's chocolatey, but it's also something else in there. Almost like malt.
So that's called buddy. That's probably the most common off flavor that people have interacted with. And buddy, it's not a scientific term. It just kind of gets you in the right time of year in terms of the season. It's at the end of the season. The tree is still dormant. It doesn't have leaves on yet. But it's getting close. And it's a hugely complex time for the tree. It's coming out of dormancy. It's breaking chemicals down that are keeping the buds dormant. It's stimulating bud development. There's a lot going on, and it's probably related to that, where there's a little bit, the chemistry of the raw sap changes enough that when you boil it, it concentrates and makes this off flavor. This was on the medium to slightly high medium flavor, and it can get worse.
Really?
It can also be more subtle than that.
Wow.
So I would say we get calls every season from people saying, well, for one, people often, it might be the first time they've looked at the upper part of the tree and said, my trees have buds on it, what should I do? Trees have buds all winter long. They do swell right before the leaves come out, but I can't tell you how much swelling will cause this flavor. You just need to, and you can't taste it in the sap. You need to boil it. You can smell it in the steam a little bit, but you can definitely taste it in the syrup.
And if you were to end up with the syrup, what do you end up? Again, it's not grade A, but what do you do with it?
Again, it depends a little bit on how severe it is, but that would fall under processing grade and would be sold at some discount, maybe a severe discount, to either someone baking with it or, again, any kind of confection that isn't trying to be grade A.
Right. The flavor is the flavor.
Right.
And depending on the ingredients, I used to run a cafe and pastry in Brooklyn, so I know all about making pastries, and the flavor is the flavor. You put that together with chocolate, and it's going to help the chocolate. It's going to give you a flavor that nobody's going to. Wow, what is that?
Right.
And you're still being true to your ingredients because it's maple syrup. It's just not. They don't care if it's grade A. They're eating it in a piece of pastry.
Right. And actually, I've had conversations with chefs who taste that and say, okay, where can I buy this?
Yeah,
I know exactly.
This is why I'm saying this.
I know exactly what to do with this flavor.
That's fascinating. My God.
Yeah, and to make things even more complicated, you can have multiple off flavors in one. So you could have a sour that's
with
also
a buddy.
buddy.
Yeah.
And what I would say to that is, just because you can't identify exactly what the cause of that off flavor is, it's helpful from a producer standpoint to avoid making it again. But at some point, it doesn't really matter why it's off flavored. It just doesn't belong in the marketplace as a grade A. My mentor at UVM, he said there are really only 3 grades of syrup. It tastes good, tastes bad, can't sell it.
Give it to the pigs.
So there's a point at which you can be a little too fine with the handling of the various off flavors, but as a producer, if you all of a sudden hit an off flavor, you want to know what it is so you can remedy it. Make sure it's not. If it's a Mother Nature off flavor, which is what we call the buddy, sour, those ones that just have to do with the chemistry of the sap changing, that's one thing. If it's something you did from your processing standpoint, then you need to know what to do to remedy it.
Right.
There's a lot of work involved in making maple syrup, and the idea of having a barrel or even a small amount go wrong is a little bit distressing.
Yeah.
So do you want to try?
Let's keep going.
Well, I don't have any more maple for you, but what I did have is I have some birch syrup.
I love birch syrup. Or anything else you have.
Yeah. So the thing with birch is that it's not maple syrup.
No.
It seems kind of silly to have to say that.
But is it the same? Is it the same realities? Are we talking 40 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of birch, or is it more?
So, 40 to 1 is the average for maple. It can be lower or it can be higher depending on the sugar content.
Right.
Birch is more on the order of 120 to 1.
Whoa. We're talking a lot more work.
A lot more work. And that's one of the reasons why early cultures really didn't produce it. You think about, and we talked about Native Americans earlier, 2% is roughly the average sap sweetness. At that level, you can make something happen with a primitive system. Mm-hmm. With birch, you just couldn't. You just couldn't collect that much firewood. It just didn't make sense. So there's a long history of drinking birch sap, but not a very much history of making it into syrup. Now it's becoming more popular because we have more efficient equipment. We have the ability to pre-concentrate sap using reverse osmosis, and you can actually make it in a reasonably efficient way.
Okay.
So, like I said, it's not maple. It's different sugars. Maple is almost all sucrose. Birch is almost all that invert sugar, which is glucose and fructose. So it's almost always very dark. And then I almost don't want to tell you what to think about the flavor. I kind of want to give it to you and let you taste it.
I'm a birch. What do they call that soda? I drink a fair amount of that.
It doesn't taste like that.
Not at all.
So
I've eaten my fair of, just full disclosure, I've eaten my fair share of birch branches, the little buds. As I walk through the woods,
sure,
you want
the
a little
wintergreen
refresher. You just bite a piece off and keep that in your mouth all day, and you're fine.
So this is not that. This is going to be a different flavor. So just again, clear your maple taste buds and get ready for something else.
Oh my God! Holy mackerel! Wow!
It is different, isn't it?
That'll wake you up in the morning. What the heck is that? That's amazing. That's birch.
That
birch syrup.
Birch syrup.
Wow. It's so overpowering that it's almost hard. It's hard to describe. But the stringiness, I can kind of feel it.
So some people would characterize it as like a tart sweetness, almost a fruitiness to it. Some people get a molasses or
I can
bitterness.
see that.
Some people get a little bit of a bitterness. That particular sample doesn't have that really strong bitterness that we sometimes get.
Wow, what did they use this for?
So you think maple is pretty small. It's maybe 1% of the total sweetener, global sweetener market. So pretty small potatoes. Well, birch is even smaller. The majority of birch syrup is produced in Alaska, where they have a huge amount of birch. We don't have a ton here. We have some, not a ton.
Yeah.
Up there, they market it as you would maple, on pancakes, on ice cream, all those things, as well as an ingredient to balance flavors in other dishes, like a glaze on ham or pork, salmon. It's very good on salmon.
Yeah, I can see that.
Chefs like it because even the bitter ones, not like this one,
right,
they like that as a balance to flavor.
Yep.
So it's getting a fair amount of attention from chefs who like to play with different flavors.
Yeah, I could see how this could be extremely... you serve that to the average customer, they have no idea what you're serving them and blown away by the flavor.
But you put it on a barbecue sauce or put it on... even on vanilla ice cream, it's quite good.
I bet.
So one interesting thing is that the birch, most people probably understand maple sap flow is a combination of freeze and thaw, and you get these periods of high flow and then a little bit of nothing until it freezes again. Birch, the season begins really at the tail end of the maple season. It's not driven by freeze and thaw. It's actually a root pressure. And you'll get this kind of upwelling of sap coming up out of the roots, and it'll run day and night, and then it'll be over. It's a very short season.
How long does it run for?
It depends on the year, but on average 2 to 3 weeks, something like that.
2 to 3 weeks.
That's pretty short compared to maple.
Good morning. You're on the air.
Good morning, Thomas. It's Jason.
Hey,
I had a question for Mark. Willie's there. I hate to cut you guys off during your birch talk, but could you just spend a couple minutes going over the research going from the 7/16 to the 5/16 and now the quarter-inch tats, the difference in the production, and just explain it real quick before you leave?
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Happy to. So
I'm going to go off the line.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you.
So I think what Jason's talking about is the diameter of the hole that you're drilling into the tree. We have to make new holes every year because the tree has a natural process of compartmentalizing that wound. Historically, it depends on how far back you go, but the most recent past, 7/16 of an inch was the standard. And that was both for bucket trees, but even some of the early tubing would use a 7/16 inch hole. When you drill into the tree, you're cutting into the tree's conductive tissue,
right?
The xylem. And we're looking at a little chunk of wood that I brought in that has a tap hole. If you think of a tree as this dense collection of straws, microscopic straws, we're cutting into some of those straws, and that's where we're getting the sap. You can make a bigger hole, and you will get more sap because you're cutting into more vessels. But it's not linear. In other words, if you don't get 10 times as much sap from a 1-inch hole as you do from a 1/10 of an inch hole.
Right.
There is a positive relationship, but it's not linear. It kind of drops off a little bit as you go bigger.
Mm-hmm.
About 25, 30 years ago, even more now, I guess, the industry moved away from 7/16 to 5/16. So smaller hole. We saw that you could get comparable amounts of sap, assuming you're using vacuum, and you get a little bit less wounding, less staining inside the tree, less non-conductive wood formation. There's also an interest in going even smaller, and 1/4 inch is the next stage down of spouts that are available currently. Our research shows that you do get less sap when you go from 5/16 to 1/4 inch. On the order of 10 to 11% less sap when you go to that smaller diameter hole. One thing that is getting attention is that our pumps now, if people are really high tech and investing a lot in their operation, you can get close to what you used to achieve with a 5/16, assuming you go higher in vacuum. But comparing apples to apples, you still are going to get less sap at the same vacuum level when you make a smaller hole, because you are severing fewer vessels,
right,
and more pipes are available. Taken to extreme, if you had this hypodermic needle and you're only severing 1 or 2 vessels at a time, proportionally you're going to get less sap. But high vacuum pumps are able to run 24/7 now, whereas it used to be dairy pumps that would smoke and blow up after a couple of days of running like that.
Mm-hmm.
Those pumps couldn't handle it, but the newer pumps can handle 24/7, and they can go higher in vacuum.
Pressure.
So we can get yields closer to what we were before with 5/16.
And this is with a quarter.
Again, at that upper
at the
level,
higher level,
which is hard to achieve.
Vacuum pressure.
There's squirrels, wind damage, people who forgot 1 or 2 taps on a line. All those things are going to have your average vacuum lower and make it harder and harder. Plus, leaks are more common the higher you go in vacuum.
Oh.
If you have just a tiny little nick out of the barb on your spout, you're going to have a leak there where you wouldn't with lower levels of vacuum.
Wow. This has been absolutely fascinating. I really appreciate you coming down. It's not a one appearance kind of show, so I really hope you'll come back.
Yep.
And
sure.
Because there's so much more to talk about. And wow.
Well, I do want to let people know if they want to reach me. If you look UVM extension Maple, and my name Mark Isselhardt, I'd be happy to answer your questions or help you if you're interested in maple production.
And also from before VTIinvasives.org if you want information about invasive species. Thank you very much, my friends, for listening. Don't forget, we repeat at 5 o'clock. Democracy Now! Follows. See you tomorrow. Now 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 follows.